The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable member for Grayndler.
Thanks, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the government for cooperation. Indeed, thank the Deputy Prime Minister and Infrastructure Minister for the cooperative way we've been working on these issues. When it comes to issues of aviation, we have tried to ensure as much bipartisanship as possible. And what that requires is a bit of compromise and perhaps not getting everything that you want. And indeed, this legislation doesn't go as far as Labor would go if we were the government, but it is an important step forward. And what we are trying to do here today is to facilitate the passage of this legislation so that it can be considered by the Senate and come into operation as soon as possible. Of course, there is no margin for error when it comes to aviation safety. It's that simple. Another responsibility of the Parliament is, of course, the need to avoid unnecessary red tape getting in the way of business activity. Business drives economic growth. It creates jobs and supports our standard of living. Aviation is an important business, particularly in regional communities, and what this legislation does is go to the issue of general aviation, where there's been a lot of concern from operators of general aviation about the regulatory burden that is placed upon them. There was a very successful conference held in Wagga Wagga in the electorate of the Deputy Prime Minister, and I had the opportunity to speak and to engage with the sector there. And this legislation that's before the Parliament now arose out of some of the recommendations from that conference. It doesn't go as far as some would like, but I believe that it is certainly a step forward, balancing the need to protect the travelling public and, of course, the desirability of ensuring that economic activity can occur. And, of course, the regulatory burden for an RPT service run by a Qantas or a Virgin or a Rex is very different from the regulatory burden that can be imposed on a small operator, on general aviation, and to maintain that business in place. And that is important, particularly in communities such as the member for Maranoa's electorate. It is really important for a range of services that general aviation is able to operate, because many of those routes simply aren't commercial for the big players. So what we've tried to do is to move forward the agenda. This bill before us, as I said, is in my view not perfect, but I'm not going to allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good and the practical, which is why I have supported this legislation. We always take a bipartisan approach to the issue of transport safety. On the issue of safety of the travelling public, we must work together because these issues should not be partisan in this parliament. And the way that we've facilitated the bringing on of this bill is an example of that. Aviation is absolutely crucial in the 21st century. One of the things that we've seen grow in recent times is that unlike when I was younger, the fact is that aviation is 5 times more affordable today than it was 25 years ago. 5 times. There are very few industries that you can point to where that is the case. The fact is that these days people will go to watch their football team or netball team or other sporting event regularly interstate without it being a big deal. The first time I hopped on a jet plane was to come here as a ministerial staffer. Before then, I'd never been on a jet plane in my life, and that wasn't uncommon for people of my generation. The fact is that aviation is now much more available, and general aviation sector is the backbone of broader aviation, from balloons to microlights, helicopters to business jets, hobbyists to professional pilots. General aviation directly employs more than 3,500 Australians. It performs essential services such as charter flights, search and rescue, firefighting, surveying and aerial photography, life-saving aeromedical care and aircraft maintenance. It's also an important training ground for the nation's pilots. And that's why the former federal Labor government, in which I had the privilege of serving as Aviation Minister, delivered the first ever aviation white paper. One of its stated objectives was the maintenance of a safe, efficient and innovative general aviation sector. This document provided a comprehensive and balanced framework, bringing together all aspects of aviation policy into a single, coherent and forward-looking statement. In particular, we introduced more generous accelerated depreciation rates for aircraft as an incentive for owners to upgrade their aircraft. We reduced the number of 24-hour restricted airspace areas from 81 to 15. We committed to the continued operation and growth of secondary capital city airports. We ensured the master plans of secondary airports maintained a strong focus on aviation development, not non-aeronautical uses that could compromise future aviation activities. And we reduced the financial burden of regulation on the sector by restricting increases in CASA regulatory service charges to rises in the Consumer Price Index. I understand general aviation's importance to our nation, and I'm optimistic about its prospects for expansion. In recent times, sections of the general aviation sector have expressed concern that CAS's strong focus on safety has created a situation where the sector is over-regulated. There has been a push for legislative recognition in the Civil Aviation Act that CASA should not consider safety, but also not just consider safety, but also the effect of safety regulation on businesses. Last July, we held the summit in Wagga Wagga that was also addressed by Minister McCormack. My point was that safety must always come first and that we must work together. We must recognise that regulators, as well as the Minister, face intense pressures in bearing the responsibility for aviation safety. And I certainly felt it when I was the Minister. I know from discussions with Minister McCormack that he has considered these matters very carefully before bringing forward this legislation. I have tried to consult with a range of organisations over this legislation and reform. The bill amends the Civil Aviation Act to ensure that when CASA develops and promulgates aviation safety standards, it takes into consideration the impacts and costs affecting the aviation sector. Existing regulatory practice is already based on that approach, but the bill incorporates the existing regulatory practice into the legislation, therefore making it very clear that, that these issues are important. The bill doesn't change CASA's responsibility to make safety its most important consideration, but what it does do is codify in the legislation the expectation of this parliament that CASA, when creating regulation, takes into account the reasonable expectations of those who are regulated. For some in the aviation sector, this bill won't go far enough, and I accept that. But it does take an important step in the right direction. It's a sign of progress in an area where any change must be carefully considered. And that's why it has been the subject of broad support across the sector. For example, Regional Air Express, the airline that services much of regional Australia, has said this in a statement. Rex welcomes the proposed amendment to the Civil Aviation Act 1998, which requires the Civil Aviation Safety Authority to consider the economic and cost impact in the development and promulgation of aviation safety standards on individuals, businesses and the community, and to take into account the differing risks associated with different aviation sectors. In closing, let me thank the Minister for his cooperation on this issue. The job of Transport Minister is a difficult one. I hope to be able to experience that again the next time this parliament sits. But in government or opposition, I would say that I want to work with my counterpart when it comes to transport issues, and in particular when it comes to aviation safety. That's why we've agreed on just one speaker aside in order to fast-track the passage of this legislation so it can get to the Senate. I commend the legislation to the House.
I thank the honourable member for Grainler. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the honourable minister.
Well, thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for Grainler. The Civil Aviation Safety Amendment Bill 2019 is an important bill, Mr Deputy Speaker. Australia has an outstanding aviation safety record due to our strong regulatory framework. However, we need to continue to keep the balance right between risk and regulation. The Civil Aviation Safety Amendment Bill 2019 ensures CASA continues to consider the economic and cost impacts on industry and communities when developing aviation safety standards. This bill is designed to support a regulatory environment which continues to maintain confidence in the safety of aviation in Australia without unnecessarily restricting innovation and growth. It is important to note that this bill is not intended to and will not in any way impede CASA's ability to make the operational decisions relating to safety. CASA must be allowed to ensure aviation in Australia is safe and reliable. In practical terms, the bill relates to CASA's work in developing and promulgating standards, taking into account the differing risks posed by those sectors and not to individual decisions or directions. The bill will not, for instance, have altered CASA's ability to make its recent decisions to stop flights of Boeing 737 MAX aircraft on safety grounds. Safety of air navigation will remain the most important consideration of CASA when it develops legislative safety standards, but CASA will also continue to take into consideration the cost, something I know is a key priority for our general aviation sector. I'd like to thank the Shadow Minister for Transport, Anthony Albanese, for his bipartisan support. I'm pleased that this bill will support local aviation businesses and communities while ensuring CASA can still do its vital work of keeping us safe in our skies. I'd like to thank the honourable members for their constructive contributions to this debate. I commend the bill to the House.
I thank the honourable minister. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. All of those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. Clerk.